Alright, this is our first segment for Tuesday's class, and we'll try to get through the beginnings of World War II. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of Hitler's Germany. Now, before we do that, keep in mind that, as we've talked about before, following World War I, the United States became extreme in its isolationism. The sense being we'd been in there once in Europe and dealt with that, and it had not done any good. Wilson had said it was a war to end all wars, but of course it was not. And there was a strong sense in the United States that we just needed to withdraw, put our heads in the sand as the cartoon had showed, and stay out of Europe and not get involved. So part of the reason that the U.S. doesn't do anything about the rise of either Germany or Japan is that we are strongly isolationist. And interestingly, Roosevelt had a different viewpoint, but he could not press too hard for that because the isolationist sentiment was so strong that even in 1940 he had to be very careful. The only thing that really knocked out the isolationism was the actual attack at Pearl Harbor. So, with that in mind, and the idea that the U.S. will not have any kind of role to play here, or at least a very minimal one, and of course did not become part of the League of Nations, which really kept the teeth out of the League of Nations, it might have actually given it some chance of survival, we now take a look at the rise of Hitler's Germany. Start with the Treaty of Versailles, and as you're very familiar with, the Treaty of Versailles was dictated by the French and the British to the Germans and caused the Germans to be forced to admit guilt in starting the war, which is somewhat questionable. Obviously, they did technically start the war, but we've talked before about how the alliance has probably made that much more likely. But the victors get to write the history books, and so they put in the guilt clause into the treaty. And as a result of that, the Germans not only had to give up their army, and of course the Kaiser had to abdicate, which caused quite a chaotic political situation in Germany. But the Germans were forced to pay reparations of gold and silver to the supposedly to the wives and orphans of dead soldiers who had fought for the Allies. It's a large amount of reparations, and while the rest of the world is doing pretty well in the 1920s, excluding the Soviets who were on their own economic system, most of the Western countries were doing relatively well as they came out of the war. Not as good as the U.S., but the Germans spent much of those 1920s paying back their reparations, and then the short version is, about the time they got done with that, then they got hit with the Great Depression. So the Treaty of Versailles will, of course, be something that's looked at later as a cause of World War II because it was so harshly punitive upon Germany. But let's talk a little bit about Hitler's rise to power. Hitler himself, of course, was actually not German. He was Austrian. And during World War I, he had actually served in the German military. Now, he'd had a pretty nondescript life in many ways. He had tried to be a painter. He had tried to be an architect. He had tried to do many different things. He and his mother, because his father, I believe, had passed away or had left, one of the two, lived together and were in essence on government assistance in Austria. And he was looking for something to make of himself. And one of the few times he actually felt happy was when he was serving in the German military in World War I, although in his role as a messenger, he ran from trench to trench. He was actually gassed a couple of times. And interestingly, he is in the hospital when World War I ends. Now, it's not just his view, but the view of many, many Germans when this war is over, that somehow they had been sold out by someone. Perhaps they're politicians, perhaps a conspiracy against Germany. But in the case of many Germans, the question they had was, how can they have been so close to victory and yet totally collapsed? And we talked about that when we looked at the end of World War I. Well, this gave rise to something called the stab in the back thesis. And this is the idea that many Germans had, that the reason they had lost the war was that somebody had sold them out, either the rich and powerful, or of course there's a sense that, again, the conspiracy, and of course when they're looking for somebody to scapegoat as part of a conspiracy, they'll look to specifically Jews and communists. But this is an idea that you have to keep in mind as you look at the rise of Hitler in power in Germany. Don't forget that, interestingly, Hitler and Roosevelt are both elected almost at the same time, within 1 week of each other. And yes, Hitler is elected, although not specifically to be chancellor, but instead his political party wins the majority of seats in the German Reichstag, or the representative body, and then appoints their leader as the chancellor or leader of Germany. They have a parliamentary system wherein if you have the majority, you get to pick who you want to lead things. Well, interestingly, at the end of World War I, after he had recovered from his second stint in the hospital as a victim of a gas attack, Hitler was chosen by the German military, what was left of it after the war, because most of the military was forced to disarm, and their navy was forced to scuttle their ships or give their ships to somebody else. In fact, the Americans actually used some for target practice as they begin the process of learning how to bomb from the air on the seas. Of course, with no German sailors aboard, they had been turned over to the Americans, and they're not manned at all when that takes place. But the few people that were still in the military were looking for some help in dealing with the chaotic political system that arose from the ashes of the Kaiser's rule, and a whole slew of political parties, over 200, seemed to pop up at this point. Now, one of them that seemed to get a little bit of traction was the National Socialist Workers' Party, or the initials for that, and the German words for that term are N-A-Z-I, and so that's where we get the idea of the Nazi Party. But this political party was just one of many others in the early 1920s. And Hitler's connection with it was that the military actually appointed him as their liaison to that party. Now, they did this because they understood that they had already picked up that he was pretty good with the understanding of politics, and they also knew he was a very good speaker, and this is something that obviously is going to take him forward. Well, as he gets more and more connected to the Nazi Party, he eventually steps in line with them and begins to work his way up their hierarchy, because they find him to be, again, a very good speaker, a very good organizer, and a pretty smart man politically. And so it won't take too long for him to become one of the leaders, or at least one of the main people in the Nazi Party. Now, as you're familiar with, perhaps, the Nazi Party's view was that the Germans had been mistreated, stabbed in the back, and that the future of the German people was a bright one that would revolve around the recreation of a culture that was from the mythical past of the Teutonic Knights and the idea of the Aryan race and so forth. So there was all kinds of stuff that was part of it that was beneath the surface, but that we'll hear about a lot later once they come into power. But initially their statement was that they really just wanted Germany to go back to its original glory, and that they had been stabbed in the back. Now, one of the things that happens is that a few people representing this idea begin to run for positions in government, begin to win. Their leader, however, will be Hitler because of his great speech-making ability. And so actually in the early 20s, Hitler will lead what's called the Beer Hall Putsch, or attempt at coup, and he and his forces, or he and his supporters, will try and take over the city of Munich's governmental buildings and try to begin taking over the government at that point. They are captured, a couple of them are shot, in fact some die. Hitler's put in jail for 5 years, and while he's in jail, of course, he dictates what becomes his very famous book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, wherein from jail he actually says exactly what it is that he plans to do. At the time when the book came out, not that many people paid that much attention to it, but of course later when he's in power, everybody wants to read it because they want to know what it is that this guy is actually focusing on. He was actually released early, which is not a huge surprise in the German system at that point, and begins to rebuild his influence in the Nazi Party, and so eventually beginning to just run for office. Now, the thing that drew people to become Nazis was pretty interesting. There were a lot of young men who were out of work, who really didn't know what they were going to do, and the Nazi Party offered them a couple of very impressive things if they would join. First, they would be part of a group that thought quite a bit of itself. They wore what were then considered to be very cool-looking uniforms, and they also went around and bullied people, which if you're somebody who has a very low self-concept and you're trying to build it up, being able to go after other people and take out your frustrations on them is something that might actually seem positive if you're a young teenage male. So a lot of the people that join the Nazi Party do so just because they get to join an organization that they think is moving forward and will give them an identity, and that's something to keep in mind. What we end up with, of course, is that by the mid-1930s, the Nazi Party actually becomes very powerful, and in fact, or actually before that, by 1932, the Nazi Party is very powerful, and so in 1932 they actually won a majority of the seats in the Reichstag, as we said earlier, and Hitler is appointed Chancellor beginning in March of 1933, coincidentally the same time that Franklin Roosevelt is taking his oath of office. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but also, very ironically, both men die in office within 1 week of each other. Roosevelt dies just before Hitler, and supposedly that might have been one of the last smiles that crossed his face, was when he had gotten word that Roosevelt had died, but it's not long after that Hitler himself commits suicide and the war is over. So, Hitler's rise to power really was based on scapegoating different groups, Jews and communists, who they disliked quite a bit. And a lot of people joined with him in this sense that Germany should have something better and that there were people to blame for the fact that they did not. Now, the form of government that Hitler will begin to install, and he does it claiming that he's using a legal democratic type system to enforce it, but really he just becomes a dictator, and is called fascism. It's a system of government characterized by a rigid one-party dictatorship, forcible suppression of the opposition, but here's the key: it's the retention of private ownership of the means of production with centralized government control. Now, of course, there's obviously belligerent nationalism and racism, glorification of war, and so forth. So if you want to look for a specific difference between fascism and communism, and even though people think of communism as being on the far left and fascism as being on the far right, the truth is they have a lot in common. You usually have a dictator, you have a lot of militarism, you have a secret police force to force everybody to stay in line. But the real big difference, obvious difference, is that people in Germany made profit during World War II. And this is, if you're familiar with the story of Schindler's List, Schindler was actually a guy who made a whole bunch of money from selling war material, but decided to take pity upon some of those he saw as being executed and saved a pretty substantial number of people from the gas chambers at Auschwitz. So, but still, the point of it is that you still had individual companies that were making quite a bit of profit during the war. Some of these companies that were supporting the regime during World War II are still around, which is rather ironic. So we end up with, once Hitler takes power, then we see the beginnings of Hitler attempting to expand his power and the nation of Germany's power. And what we'll see occur is that Hitler will push his troops into other places. First, he'll violate the rules and actually create a military, both an army and an air force, first claiming that the army is the Boy Scouts and that the air force is going to deliver the mail, which was pretty ridiculous since there aren't too many airplanes that deliver the mail by dropping them out of bomb bay doors. But he was pushing the envelope of what would be allowed, but the League of Nations, although they had some grumbling about it, really did nothing about it. And his future major enemies were very fearful and didn't want to do anything about it. And that's where we get appeasement, which is the idea that both the French and British specifically, the U.S. of course because we decided to stay out of it, but definitely the French and British, allowed the Germans to continually violate the rules of the Treaty of Versailles and then later the rules and regulations of the League of Nations until they finally had to draw the line. And there's a sense that if they had tried to stop Hitler at any point before they finally did, he would never have been as powerful, and thus World War II would not have been as difficult as it was. So we'll pick up with U.S. isolationism and the U.S. getting into the war with our next section.